Greetings, this is Dan Coonan. I am in Philadelphia at Independence Hall. Classic, iconic spot in America. Of course, the Declaration of Independence in 1776 was signed here, and a little more than a decade after that, at the Constitutional Convention, our founders produced a Constitution. And my subject today is the father of the Constitution, James Madison, who JFK called our most underrated president. He was maybe he is less known. I would think he's less known than most of the others. And he wasn't the physical. He didn't have the stature, that impressive stature of Washington. He couldn't write like Jefferson. He wasn't witty like Benjamin Franklin. Didn't have the speaking and debating skills of someone like Patrick Henry. But my gosh, what a legacy he left, and a complicated one. I'm going to get into that as well. Like all of the founders, or many of the founders, his is a complicated legacy that includes both the very best of America and the worst of America. And the nice thing is, for my novel, Presidential Spirits, the protagonist, the president in my novel, just wants to draw on the best of them, so he can cast aside the other aspects and get inspired and emulate some of the best principles and values. And there were certainly many of those with James Madison. He was 5'4", 100 pounds. So people like Washington and Jefferson had essentially a foot on him and 100 pounds, and he talked in a squeaky voice, but my gosh, he overcame all of that. Like I'm trying to overcome a little maintenance work around here as I do this, but he overcame all that and really carved out for him and for the country something really special. And he had an impact, unquestionably, that stood the test of time. He grew up in Virginia on a plantation, and was born into privilege, really. His family had wealth, they had connections. He was the oldest, he had 11 siblings. They had private tutors and the best schooling, and he went off to college at the College of New Jersey, which is now Princeton, and really had a lot of fortune in his youth to set him up potentially for a number of things. When he left Princeton, he wasn't sure what he wanted to do. He thought about being a minister, but scrapped that. He thought about law, but decided not to do that. He didn't think the plantation suited him, and then so he was, like a lot of us, leaving college. He wasn't sure what he really wanted to sink his teeth into, and then came the Revolution, and James Madison had a cause. And at first he joined the Virginia militia, and at 5'4" and 100 pounds, it didn't work. And he was also very sickly, and that did not work out. However, because of his smarts and his tendency just to devour books, and his love of politics and philosophy, he had a lot to offer, and with his connections, he got appointed a delegate to the Virginia Convention, where he met Thomas Jefferson, and of course that really changed his life. And that was an alliance, one of the most powerful alliances in American history. It produced really 24 years of presidency, with Jefferson's 2 terms, followed by Madison's 2 terms, followed by Monroe's 2 terms, and that was something significant, meeting Thomas Jefferson. And he distinguished himself, in spite of his squeaky voice and his small stature. He distinguished himself in Virginia by speaking out against the British and with his passion, and he was always the most prepared in the room, and so people learned pretty quickly that when he was speaking, you were going to be listening. The way he distinguished himself in Virginia made him a delegate to the Continental Congress, and he was part of the Continental Congress that produced our Articles of Confederation that governed the United States for the first decade, while he went back to Virginia and was involved in Virginia politics. He realized very quickly that the Articles of Confederation were not going to work. There was no judiciary, no federal judiciary, no ability to generate any revenue for the federal government, and no executive, and it was a collection of states, but little more beyond that. And he and Alexander Hamilton both realized if this country was going to work, there needed to be a much stronger federal government. He and others called for a constitutional convention in 1787, and at a minimum, the Articles of Confederation were going to need to be amended. And both Hamilton and Madison felt that not only that, they needed to throw it out and start all over. And so they called for a constitutional convention in 1787, and people gathered here at Independence Hall for 100 days between May and September of 1787. Madison got here early, and he presented the Virginia Plan, which was very different than the Articles of Confederation, and meant throwing them out, not just amending them. He was the most prepared person here by a long shot. Thomas Jefferson from Paris had sent him 200 books about government in various languages, but any books that Jefferson could get his hands on that dealt with the formation of governments in history, as far back as recorded history could go. And Madison poured over all of that. They called it the literary cargo, and Madison holed up in his library on the top floor of his estate at Montpelier, and he went through all of that, and he studied the philosophy of government and tried to pick and choose from the very best ideas that have ever been in play when leaders are determining governance, and especially anything that resembled a republic. And Madison was well schooled in that, and that informed his own preparation of the Virginia Plan, which was the starting point for the Constitutional Convention. At the Constitutional Convention, Madison famously took a seat right up front in the center, right across from Washington, who was the presiding officer, and just staked out his territory right there. And he got up and he told the group at the outset that what they were about to embark on was historic and would decide forever the fate of Republican forms of government. And if they failed, it might never get tried again. So he set the stakes very high. He had a real sense of the history that was being made in that moment, and challenged the others to meet that occasion. His big challenge was to, with government by the consent of the people, and a democratic form of government like they were putting together, he was concerned with powerful factions and how to mitigate against that, and that led to really this separation of powers that he embraced, and that was evident in the Virginia Plan and was not evident at all in the Articles of Confederation. And he presented that and started to frame the debate that way in these three separate but co-equal branches of government. And again, he was concerned with, gosh, if a majority party got in power, They could trample individual liberties, they could trample on minority parties, and what he was crafting was his attempt to prevent that from happening, because that would spell disaster for the country in his mind. Madison's sense of the history of the moment caused him to take detailed notes. Now, one, he wanted to send them to Thomas Jefferson, who was in Paris, and keep him apprised of everything that was going on in his absence. But more importantly, he wanted history to know. He had studied all these governments, and he wished that he had that kind of record when all these other leaders from ancient history were putting together their governments. He wished that he had a record of the proceedings and the arguments back and forth, so he could see that. And he made sure that anyone doing this in the future was going to have his notes from the Constitutional Convention to draw on. And he did that. And so in that sense, not only did he propose the plan, draft the Constitution, draft the Bill of Rights, work with the Federalist Papers to get it passed, but he also preserved the record for history as well. And again, it was his knowledge that this was something really special happening that prompted him to do that. And of course, as we know, his preparation and attention to detail, it paid off. And it distinguished him in the room, and it ruled the day. And in 100 days, they produced a constitution. They produced it in spite of some objections about there needs to be more protection for individual liberties, but they produced it with the knowledge, with the promise, really, that a Bill of Rights would be done. So when these states were ratifying, they would know that there would be a Bill of Rights. And then Madison not only proceeded to draft that Bill of Rights, but he and John Jay and Alexander Hamilton, they drafted the Federalist Papers, which a series of 77 essays after the convention that were published in papers around the country that were intended to help get it passed and explain the various aspects of the separation of powers and all the other aspects that went into this and the justification for each of them. And so that was extremely influential in getting the Constitution passed as well. And of course, he drafted the Bill of Rights, 10 of which, the first 10 amendments that he drafted of the 12, the first 10, which we refer to as the Bill of Rights, was added to the Constitution. It was, it had to be approved in every state, and it wasn't a slam dunk. Even in Virginia, it wasn't a slam dunk. And Madison had a very famous debate with Patrick Henry, who I described earlier, was quite a speaker and quite a debater. And they went at it, and Patrick Henry thought that he was worried about the executive power and that it might lead toward a monarchy. And so he and Madison squared off in a debate in Virginia over that, and Virginia ended up, not by a large margin, but Virginia ended up helping to put the Constitution over the top. Madison's sense of the monumental moment in history was evident when he said to the Virginia legislature that if they were to approve this, he would think it would be one of the most fortunate events ever to happen to human nature. This is a classic painting by Howard Chandler Christie of the signing of the Constitution. That's Ben Franklin, classic, sitting in the middle, and Hamilton whispering in his right ear to the left of him as we look at him. To the right of him as we look at him, this much smaller gentleman is James Madison, seated right in the middle of that convention. Of course, you see Washington standing, presiding over the convention to the far right. The Constitution and the Bill of Rights got passed, but Madison's work was not done. He helped convince Washington to be the first president. Of course, he had to run and be elected, which he was unanimously. He was with Jefferson and Hamilton in the room where it happened, the famous dinner party at Thomas Jefferson's house in New York, the capital at the time, when they made a bargain in exchange for Hamilton's financial plan and strong central government with respect to the finances of the country. They conceded that which they had been opposing. Hamilton conceded that the capital of the country would move south along the Potomac, which became Washington, D.C., of course. The capital moved to Philadelphia first from New York, and then to Washington, D.C. He became a congressman, and a very influential congressman. He advised Washington throughout the Washington administration. He also wrote Washington's first farewell address, the address that Washington was going to give after 4 years. He wanted to leave, and he tabled that and trotted it out 4 years later, and Hamilton revised it. At that time, also, Madison and Jefferson started to get involved in some real partisan politics. Madison had been aligned with Hamilton after when we were governed by the Articles of Confederation to have a powerful federal government. But once he got the Constitution in place and Hamilton continued to push for a powerful federal government, that's where Madison separated, and their political alliance ended there. And Madison and Jefferson formed the Democratic Republican Party, really to oppose Hamilton in that effort. And not only that, they got a really for their day a very partisan newspaper going, the National Gazette, which was focused on politics and bashed the administration. I mean, Jefferson was part of the administration, the Washington administration, and the National Gazette, which was kind of behind the scenes being kind of run by these folks, was bashing the administration. And in fact, Jefferson had someone on that he was paying on the federal government with the state, he was Secretary of State from the Department of State, who was the editor of the National Gazette. So this was Fox News, MSNBC, well before Fox News and MSNBC, with the same concept. And of course, Hamilton responded with his own paper that promoted his ideas and promoted the Washington administration, and the two of them kind of went at it in the press. In 1794, Madison is introduced to Dolly Todd, who would become Dolly Madison, by, of all people, Aaron Burr. Aaron Burr was a classmate of Madison's at the College of New Jersey, and Dolly was recently widowed, and by the way, Jefferson had tried to set Madison up through the years, and Madison, it's fair to say, was not comfortable around ladies, and that's a theme with a few of these guys. And he was 43 and unmarried, and so when Aaron Burr suggested it to Dolly, she said, "Sure, I'd love to meet the great little Madison," which I love that quote. But anyhow, and so they met, and Madison used her cousin to ultimately to convey to Dolly. So Dolly's cousin, through Madison, conveyed to Dolly Madison's feelings for Dolly, and it's kind of a crazy inverse Cyrano de Bergerac kind of thing, and that sealed the deal. They were married, and in the letter to Jefferson, the letter where Madison tells Jefferson that he got married, it's kind of just an afterthought. He talks about, he spends the first part of the letter talking about architecture and Monticello and getting some advice, and then he talks about some deer a neighbor is going to send to Jefferson. At the end of the letter, he says, "Oh, by the way, I've accomplished that alliance that I've been soliciting for some time now," and that's how he conveyed to Jefferson that he had gotten married. And I'm not sure why I think that's so funny, but. And I mean, it should be said, Dolly Madison was, as we all know, I think, was very different than Madison. Gregarious and, my gosh, extroverted and great with making connections with people. And she's famous for, of course, the parties that she threw at the White House, and how she would include everyone, regardless of party, and there were some pretty partisan politics in the time, and there were political enemies, but they were all invited to those parties, and that had great value to Madison as well. And of course, Dolly Madison became close with Thomas Jefferson and his family as well. And when Jefferson became president, he made James Madison his Secretary of State, and so James and Dolly, when they moved to D.C., they moved into the White House. It was called the President's House at the time, but they went there and stayed there until Dolly ultimately moved them out to their own place in D.C. But it just kind of gives you a sense of how close they were. There's also a room at Monticello, Jefferson's house, that was referred to as Mr. Madison's room, because they went there so often. And also, it's worth noting that Sally Hemings, who is the slave woman from Monticello that Jefferson had several children with, one of those children she named Madison Hemings at the behest of Dolly Madison, who was staying there when that child was born. After 8 years of Jefferson's presidency, Madison easily won victory in 1808, and of course Hamilton had been killed by Burr, and in that kind of eliminated both of them as potential presidential rivals. Monroe kind of went after it a little bit, but he was aligned with Jefferson and Madison, and he agreed not to seek it too aggressively, and so Madison took office. His presidency was dominated a little bit by the War of 1812, and that was a struggle. The British were at war with France and were interfering with U.S. trade, and there was tension over Canada as well, and so the United States declared war on Britain, and it really marred his presidency in many ways. So the battle came right to D.C., the Battle of Bladensburg, and Madison, he actually grabbed a couple of dueling pistols in the White House, and he rode into the battle, and immediately decided we better go to the rear here. I mean, here's the gentleman who had basically kind of flunked out of the Virginia militia was now potentially leading troops into battle, but again, he went right to the rear. And his Secretary of State, Monroe, was leading a line of troops at that battle. They lost the Battle of Bladensburg. The British then proceeded to come and burn the White House. Dolly Madison, of course, famously with one of Madison's slaves, Paul Jennings, and some others, saved a famous portrait of George Washington before the British could burn the White House.
By the way, that painting of George Washington by Gilbert Stuart, which was saved, still hangs in the White House today.
Madison was succeeded as president by his friend and fellow Democratic Republican James Monroe on the left here. That's Jefferson in the middle and Madison on the right. And so all in all, this Virginia dynasty accounted for the first 24 years of the new century, from 1800 to 1824. I think any assessment of Madison's legacy, you've got to talk about slavery. he inherited slaves at age 18 from his folks, and he had a slave, Paul Jennings, who worked alongside him for 30 years from age 10 and was at Madison's side when he passed away. And Jennings and others, especially after Washington had freed his slaves upon his death, felt that Madison might do the same. He did not. He did in his will indicate that the slaves were to go to Dolly, and that they weren't to be sold without their consent. But that was not, that had no legal effect, and some of them ultimately were sold without their consent. He had a mixed record as a legislator on it as well. He once spoke in favor in Virginia of a bill that would have gradually abolished slavery, and he opposed a bill that would have prohibited people from freeing their slaves. But that's, he didn't go further than that. And Ben Franklin, one of Ben Franklin's last acts was to sign a petition to Congress to abolish slavery. And Madison, while biographers say that he detested slavery, and his acts don't suggest that at all. And with respect to Franklin's bill, and Madison was in the House at that time, he thought, he opposed it. He thought that the country was not ready for it, and that Georgia and South Carolina would rebel if they passed what Franklin was asking them to pass, to abolish slavery. So when it counted, he was not pushing to abolish it. He had and you know, a lot of people say, well, it was the times, and that was the prevailing feeling for the times, and you can't really judge with values 250 years later. And I understand that argument, but there were people in those times that felt very differently, and Edward Coles was one of them, and he was a Virginia planter just like these other folks, and he got in Jefferson's face, and he got in Madison's face, and he by the way had worked for Madison, and he was an abolitionist, and he moved to Illinois, and he took his slaves with him and bought them farms and freed them, and he wrote back to Madison to tell him that, and while Madison thought that was admirable, he did not think that was going to work out for them, and so my only point is there were some people that were really pushing on these issues and did have a more enlightened view of that in that time. Madison says that he thought that the slaves, their condition was improved following the Revolution, and whether there's evidence of that, I'm not sure. But it is the terrible part of James Madison's legacy and many of the others. So when it comes to summing them up, you can't sum them up in a couple of minutes. You can't sum them up in 20 minutes, which I'm imagining this might be about 20 minutes this way. But it's complicated. And my gosh, what he did for the Constitution may have outshined all of them. I mean, certainly they needed Washington to make it a country and to get freedom and to win the war against the British, and to keep the various potential factions going in the first couple terms of the new country. But there's no Constitution really that's lasting for 250 years without Madison, without the research that he did and the arguments that he made, and just the dogged pursuit of getting that thing passed. That doesn't happen, and that I mean, therein lies his very lofty legacy, and with that, the best part of his legacy is phenomenal, and it's not just a legacy in America. I mean, that's a legacy that extends worldwide, and other constitutions and other forms of government, republics and democracies that have been formed ever since and will be, and they have the record that Madison put together in his notes, and he, in the sense of the moment, he took those notes, and his instructions were to release them only after he died, which they were. He was by the way, he was the last signer of the Constitution to die, and 4 years later, his notes were released. But by the way, he did, in the end, he wasn't doing this, I don't think, to get great praise. And you look at the history, it doesn't necessarily maybe give him his just due on that. And in the end, he was a little bit humble about it, in terms of, hey, people might give me this credit. There were a lot of hands involved in that, and a lot of minds and a lot of thinking that went into that. And I think that's admirable, because so many of those folks were really pushing for their own legacies. His legacy is complicated, not only politically, because he crafted this document which really helps guard against powerful factions, as they call them powerful parties, partisan politics. But he was a partisan politician, so there's that irony that you got to deal with. His presidency, again, had some issues, and then of course slavery. There's just obviously no justification for that piece. The best of Madison is really, really spectacular, and distinguishes him clearly. And the worst of him is, of course, is deplorable, and that makes him much like many of the others in my novel, In the Saloon, by the way. But the nice thing is, my president and protagonist can draw on the best of all of them, and he does. And Madison steps up in the saloon to give a toast on the president's first night, and it's, of course, it's a toast wrapped up in the Constitution and the separation of powers, which we owe to him, and that's something pretty special. I loved writing this novel, Presidential Spirits. I'm enjoying doing these profiles. There's so much awesome history here to draw on, and really the best of America is pretty phenomenal. And it's good just to reacquaint yourself with that every once in a while. I hope you enjoy your time in the saloon. I hope take a shot at the novel. We are better than this, America. So much better. We all know that. Cheers.